everyone, and welcome to what will be the final event of the year for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director, and we are so glad you have decided to join us here tonight. Or if you're watching the replay, thank you so much for taking the time to watch tonight's recording. We think we have a really great program to finish off the year. And we want to get into it, but I have a few things that I need to mention first. First and foremost, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and therefore we do not take any stances on particular issues, policies, candidates, etc. We are here as a platform for discussion of global issues, and we hope that you take the information you hear tonight and make your own conclusions from the information presented. We also want to give a thank you to our sponsors. Southern New Hampshire University is our mission partner, and we appreciate all of the wonderful support that they give to our organization throughout the year. Also, the John Bickford Foundation and Karen and Stephen Barndollar. Thank you both for your ongoing support of our programs. As we are coming into the end of the year, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is working to ensure that we are preparing for a strong 2022. We'll see if we can get back to any in-person programming or if the Omicron variant of the coronavirus continues to require these online virtual events. But for those of you who do not live in the area or can't make it to in-person events when they do return, we will be providing an opportunity for virtual attendance for all of our future programs, which we're very excited about. Having said that, we are a membership organization. We are a small nonprofit and rely on the support of our community to ensure that we can continue these wonderful programs. And so we would ask that if you are not already a member, that you consider joining the organization as a member. You can do so on our website at wacnh.org. You can also donate to our annual fund. We have a $7,500 challenge grant that is going on right now, thanks to a number of donors. At this point, we are about 90% of the way to our goal, but we need your support in order to get all of the way to where we want to be in order to ensure a strong 2022 and a strong return to our programs. Finally, I want to mention that there are a couple of ways you can send us your questions here tonight. You can send those questions to us via our email address, council@wacnh.org. You can send it to our social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or if you are on our website watching there is a chat function in the bottom right-hand corner, and we invite you to watch or send your questions to us that way. We'll get them loaded up for you during the question and answer session. Okay, having that all out of the way, I'd like to bring Ambassador David McKean on screen. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving us your time here tonight. Ambassador McKean was the ambassador to Luxembourg in 2016-2017. Prior to that, he was the director of policy planning at the U.S. Department of State. He has a long career in foreign relations. He has a lot of connections to New Hampshire and New England, a summer residence up here. He stopped by our office a few weeks ago to record a couple of those teaser videos that you may have seen on our social media. But he's worked for a number of congressional members out of Massachusetts, John Kerry, Joseph Kennedy II. And most importantly, he is the author of 5 books, 2 of which he'll talk about extensively tonight. Watching Darkness Falls, his most recent book, and Partners of First Resort. So we are really interested to hear what you have to share with us tonight, Ambassador, and we will turn it over to you for your remarks, and we'll get into some questions.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Tim. I want to thank you and Alan and the council for hosting me tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And for those of you who are listening, I know you are interested in international affairs, and I think that's incredibly important in this day and age. So I thank you for being a part of this as well. And I'm delighted to talk to you about my new book, Watching Darkness Fall, FDR's Ambassadors and the Rise of Adolf Hitler. It was just released about 3 weeks ago. And it describes our diplomacy during the 1930s. It's very much a history book. It's not a policy book. One reviewer, I'm happy to say, praised it as a good idea of describing, McKean had a good idea of describing the milieu of ambassadors and by assessing the policies and they pursued and the actions they took. Someone who was not quite as charitable, an online reader, sort of derided it as a popular history. And honestly, I don't mind it being characterized as a popular history because I think it's important to make history accessible to people. And I actually think this is a really interesting story, a good story. And I have to say, I hope many of you will buy the book. I also will then talk a little bit about a book that I wrote earlier, that was released earlier in the year that Tim referred to, called Partners of First Resort. And I don't recommend that you buy that book. I think you can check it out at the library. But it's a book I wrote with a former colleague of mine on the policy planning staff. It's published by the Brookings Press, and it really is a policy book. It's about the Transatlantic Alliance. The first half of the book recounts the history of our relationship with Europe after World War II, while Watching Darkness Fall takes us right up to World War II. And one reviewer described it as an applied history, and certainly in many senses it is. But we also talk about the internal and the external challenges to the Transatlantic Alliance. And we make some recommendations about how we think to move forward. Now, this was a book we turned in, a year ago before the Biden administration was in power. And certainly some of these recommendations they've already undertaken. So let me just return, if I can, to Watching Darkness Fall for a minute and tell you a little bit about it. It's a book where there have been so many books written about Franklin Roosevelt, but this, I think, is a fresh take on him in some ways, because it tells the reader a little bit about how Roosevelt came to make the decisions he did during the 1930s in terms of Europe, because it's only focused on Europe. It's not focused on the foreign policy writ large of Franklin Roosevelt or on what was happening in Asia at the time. But I try to give some idea of sort of what the United States was, what it was like at the time, what the mood of the country was, what the political situation was at the time, and to then sort of, if I'm able, I try to put it in the context of this sort of, particularly in Europe, of this global depression and the impending and building towards war. So there are 4 ambassadors that I focus on in this book. William Dodd, who was the ambassador to Germany. Breckenridge Long, who was the ambassador to Italy. William Bullitt, the ambassador our very first ambassador to the Soviet Union. And then he was ambassador to France from 1937 to 1940. And lastly, Joe Kennedy, who, as many of you are familiar with, who was the ambassador to the Court of St. James from 1938 to 1940. There's also a supporting cast in this book. Eleanor Roosevelt is very much a powerful figure in the Roosevelt administration. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, and Harry Hopkins. So those are the sort of key people. And let me just briefly tell you about the ambassadors again, because I think they are the key people in this book. So, in 1933, when Roosevelt's elected, He is charged with appointing a new set of ambassadors. He understands that Germany is a very important country. For one thing, there are a lot of reparations owed as a result of World War I, which, and with the United States in the midst of a depression, it's something that Roosevelt cares about. He wants those debts paid. He also understands that there are some authoritarian impulses in that country. He's aware of Hitler already at that time, even though Hitler was not in power. And he wants a strong ambassador. He asks several prominent men, and really all the ambassadors in those days, all the diplomats in those days were men, to be ambassador to Berlin, and he can't find anybody. He has his former, as you may know, Roosevelt ran on a national ticket in 1920. He asked his running mate, who was the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, James Cox, to be the ambassador. Cox turns him down. Others do as well. He finally settles on William Dodd, who's really a little-known academic at the University of Chicago with no diplomatic experience, no political experience, but he has spent time in Germany. He does speak German pretty well. And he's a great admirer of Woodrow Wilson, as is Franklin Roosevelt. And he is confirmed easily by the United States Senate, sent to Germany. And it's a difficult, very difficult time that he has there for the next 4 years. And he quickly recognizes that the Nazis are extremely dangerous, and he tries to sound the alarm bell on many, many occasions. But he's in many ways he's set aside by those in power in the Department of State. Roosevelt has a direct relationship with this ambassador, as he does with all of these individuals, but Dodd is set aside. The second individual I talk about is Breckenridge Long, who served in the Wilson administration. He had an office down the hall from the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt. So they got to know each other then. And Roosevelt liked him. Long is a sort of wealthy, aristocratic type who went to Princeton, had a political career in the Midwest, not terribly successful. But he's a very good political organizer, and he works on Roosevelt's campaign in 1932, and Roosevelt rewards him with an ambassadorship in Italy. And Long becomes a terrific supporter of Mussolini. He thinks Mussolini is doing a terrific job. He eventually has some health issues and is brought back to the United States. Roosevelt then puts him in a big job in the State Department as he's an assistant secretary by title, but part of his portfolio is immigration. And I say in the book, I think he's the worst appointment that Roosevelt perhaps made in the entire administration, because what he does is he does everything in his power to keep European Jews from coming into the United States. And as a result, I think costs. The ambassador I talk about is William Bullitt. I mentioned that he was the first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. He'd actually negotiated when he was a member of the negotiating team at the talks in Paris in 1919. He actually negotiated with Lenin at the age of he was only 28 years old. Roosevelt didn't meet him until the 1932 campaign, but he was so impressed with him that he immediately decided that this was a man he wanted in his administration. And indeed, Bullitt was a very, very intelligent man. He'd gone to Yale. He had a great knowledge of European history, made a very charismatic, charming figure. And he and Roosevelt get along extremely well. And but in the end, Bullitt decides that while he had high hopes for his time in the Soviet Union, that he's being spied upon, that there's nothing to negotiate with Stalin and his cronies, that they're corrupt. He's being spied, and he just is thoroughly discouraged with his time there. So he comes back to the United States, helps Roosevelt on the 1936 campaign, and afterwards goes briefly back to the Soviet Union, and then is appointed the ambassador to Paris. Plays an important role there, actually. And while he gives Roosevelt some not terribly helpful advice in 1937, after the Munich Agreement, he really understands that there's not going to be peace in Europe. And he advises Roosevelt to rearm the United States and to build a very powerful Air Force. He understands the power. He understands that air power is going to decide the future of the war. The last ambassador, and by the way, I think William Bullitt's not a terribly well-known figure in American diplomacy, and yet he's one of the more fascinating people I've read about ever. The last ambassador I talk about is Joe Kennedy. Many of you are familiar with him. This was not a successful relationship that he had with Franklin Roosevelt. I describe it as sort of a chess match, and the pieces were stacked against Joe Kennedy partially because he was his own worst enemy. And I think he had the impression that, and it's not clear that Roosevelt gave him this impression, but Kennedy certainly believed that he was there he was in England to make policy. And he was very much an appeaser. He didn't like Hitler, but he felt that Hitler's victory was inevitable and that we needed to reach some sort of economic accommodation with Hitler. And Roosevelt did not want him back in the country in 1939, 1940, because he worried that he was going to interfere and meddle in the election. So it was a very complicated relationship. The two men had known each other a long time, but ultimately they really didn't like each other. So, I think what in the end is sort of the most fascinating to me is, as I said in the beginning of this talk, is Franklin Roosevelt. And I'll tell you briefly why. I found Roosevelt, he is an enormously empathetic individual. He really does feel for other people. And yet he's an extraordinarily unsentimental president. And we can talk about that at a later point. He's an enormously political individual. He's always got his political antenna up. He reads polls frequently. He at one point, when he is defeated in his effort to have the United States become a member of the World Court, he said, it's a terrible thing when you're looking over your shoulder and you see that nobody's there to follow you. Yet Roosevelt, I believe, was an enormously courageous president as well, that he understood at what point to provide the kind of leadership that was necessary. And finally, I will say about Roosevelt that he was, I believe, enormously pragmatic, but he was also an idealist. And it's this last sort of contradiction in Roosevelt that in any way links these two, in my view, links these two books together. Because near the end of Watching Darkness Fall, I describe how Roosevelt and Churchill meet off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, in the fall of 1941. This is a meeting that's arranged by Harry Hopkins. Interestingly, Roosevelt had met Churchill during the First World War, because Churchill was then the First Lord of the Admiralty. They did not like each other. And Roosevelt believed that he believed the English had sort of a superior attitude, and he felt that Churchill was a snob. Actually, Churchill didn't really remember meeting Roosevelt at all. But at that point, London was being bombed. The United Kingdom was in dire straits. He really wanted to meet with Roosevelt, and the two of them meet off the coast of Newfoundland, and they issue something called the Atlantic Charter. And I begin Partners of First Resort with a discussion of the Atlantic Charter. And let me just briefly describe what that is. It is a set of principles, and those principles, given the time and given that it was Roosevelt and Churchill, they're quite extraordinary. And that was that nations should be allowed to govern themselves. So there's the principle of self-government, that the sovereignty of nations was very important, that no nation should take land or territory from another nation, that free trade was critically important to the well-being of citizens of the world. And finally, there was what Roosevelt described as sort of the four freedoms were sort of incorporated into this. And the four freedoms were a domestic set of principles, but he incorporated them into the Atlantic Charter as well. And that was freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom from fear. The last being obviously the fear of authoritarianism and fascism in Europe. So the Atlantic Charter, we argue in Partners of First Resort, it forms the foundation for many of the post-war multilateral institutions that we know today. The United Nations, which was created in 1945, NATO, which came about in 1949. And just a very quick word on NATO. Don't forget that NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it doesn't say the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. It doesn't say the U.S. It doesn't say the Transatlantic Alliance. And that's because, again, alliances were very controversial, but dating back really to President Washington, who talked about no entangling alliances. And so in order to get this passed by the Senate, they had to give it this name, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which I always found to be fascinating. Other, multilateral organizations, the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which was really the beginning of the European Economic Community. It was led by 6 countries at the time. The European Union was then founded in the early 90s with 19 members and has since grown to 27. And so we describe in this book, not only this sort of period, post-war period, but we bring it up to both the Obama and the Trump administrations. I won't go into that now. We ultimately call for a restatement of the Atlantic Charter, and we suggest a number of areas where we think there are commonalities and where the Transatlantic Alliance could be strengthened. Incidentally, President Biden actually did issue a restatement of the importance of the Atlantic Charter. He didn't do it with the Europeans. He did it with the recent exit from the European Union with Boris Johnson in England. So it's sort of an interesting contradiction there. If I had to sort of describe the 4 or 5 things that I think kind of link these 2 books and link our history. That I've given you sort of both books, and I hope in less than 15 minutes, about 15 minutes. But if I had to sort of give the 4 or 5 things that I think really bridge these two books and really describe the last 80 years of American diplomacy, number one, it would be that not much good happens internationally without the United States being involved in leading. And I certainly saw that as the director of policy planning. Number two, it would be that diplomacy matters hugely and that presidential leadership matters a lot. Number three, that both the Transatlantic Alliance and whatever you call it, the liberal international order, the rules-based order, has been enormously successful. It has brought democracy to a lot of countries and certainly has been successful from an economic point of view as well. And that, that is also true in sort of what I'd say the fourth principle, which is that alliances are hugely important to sustaining the liberal international order in the face of the rise of illiberal states, which clearly is a challenge now. And lastly, it's not really covered in either one of these books, although it is, I think, implicit. It's certainly implicit in the book on Roosevelt, because again, the Great Depression was raging during the 1930s, and we do actually mention it at the end of our book on Partners of First Resort, and that is that we need to fortify our democratic institutions at home. I mean, this is not a new argument. It's not my argument. Richard Haass at the Council on Foreign Relations wrote a long book about it. Countries around the world do look to the United States. And when they see a country that respects the rule of law, that really provides freedom to its citizens, it does mean something. So those are sort of generally the issues that I think unite these two books. But again, they're very different. One is I think a readable history and easy to pick up and read 100 pages at a time, and the other one's a little bit more dense. I also think it's readable, but it's just a different kind of book. So I'll leave it at that, and look forward to your questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, for your remarks. We've had a lot of great questions come in already, and we do hope people will continue to send in their questions. You can see on screen how to do that right now. So please do keep these questions coming. What I wanted to start off with first, though, is my own question. Can you talk to us a little bit about that sort of importance and vital need for a strong U.S. European alliance or partnership, organization, whatever term we need to use to make it palatable. But a lot of what's being talked about today is China, pivot to Asia, etc. So can you talk a little bit about whether or not that the U.S. Alliance or partnership with Europe and the EU is still important and valuable today?
Sure. So, a couple of things on that. First of all, let's talk about China briefly. And I know you've had a number of other speakers who have delved into this and have greater expertise than I do. But China is today, and it was 5 years ago when I was in the Department of State, it does provide an enormous challenge to the United States. I mean, I thought someone put it well recently that we are trying to, manage the decline of Russia, which I'm not sure is entirely accurate, but it certainly is. Russia is not the powerful country that China is, and we are also trying to manage the rise of China. And China is an extremely difficult actor. There are so many issues on which we are competing with them now. And I think these were a number of issues which I think 10 years ago we would have thought we might have been able to cooperate with them on. But now it's competing. And whether it's predatory economic behavior on their part, whether it's their human rights record in Tibet with the Uyghurs, in Hong Kong, what's the current issues surrounding Taiwan. They had I think 150 flew 150 planes over Taiwan airspace in a matter of 4 days, violating international air rights. South China Sea, that was a big issue when I was there. The East China Sea, and they're also increasingly cozying up to our adversaries, whether it's Iran or Venezuela, really, you name it. They do have a strategy. They have a strategy that of Belt and Road, which is very much a forward-looking economic strategy. And I could tell you, I'll tell you a couple of quick stories. One when I was traveling in Africa, I believe it was in 2015, and we had something like $25 million in economic assistance that we were trying to give to 3 or 4 of the countries that were in the most need, total collectively. And really, it was interesting because we went to Ethiopia, we went to Angola, we went to Congo, and everywhere we went, we had wonderful meetings, and they were our counterparts were they wanted American business. They actually liked Americans. As we were leaving, the American flags were going down, the Chinese flags were going up, and they had something like $250 million. I mean, literally 10 to 20 times more that they were prepared to offer in terms of development aid to these countries. So they are being very aggressive. They have more embassies and consuls than we do around the world now. They're being very active in their development aid, very active in their diplomatic outreach, and very active in their military buildup as well. So when you think about it, those are major challenges. Now, the United States and Europe, what we have going for us is that we share a similar set of values. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in human rights. We believe in preserving the planet for future generations. And so that these things are, very, very important. We believe in free trade, ultimately, even though we have our differences, and we have serious differences. So given that, together, the United States with our European allies and throw in Japan and Australia as well, we account for more than 60% of GDP. We're enormously powerful. We have enormous leverage, and we have to use that leverage in concert, I believe. Militarily, it's the same thing. We alone, America is a more powerful country militarily than China, but that is not necessarily going to be the case in the future. And we need to continue to work with our European allies, who, by the way, are beginning to focus more on China at NATO, because they understand that China is making inroads to Europe as well. So, I think the alliance, the Transatlantic Alliance, is more important than ever now, and we have serious challenges with a number of illiberal states. China being first and foremost, but our alliances are they are. I think Nick Burns said this. They're our comparative advantage, and I believe that's true.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. We had Ambassador Burns up here in 2019. Really enjoyed hearing from him on sort of some of the foreign policy priorities he saw coming up the road. So I want to jump into some of the questions that have come through. And we're going to start off with a question from Steve here, going back to the 1930s and wondering, do you see any parallels between the interest level of Americans in international engagement in the 1930s as well as today?
That's a terrific question. I do. I mean, it's both interest in international affairs and disinterest in international affairs. I mean, I think it's an interesting issue. First of all, I think a lot of people think that sort of America First started with Donald Trump. It did not. There was a very active America First movement in the 1930s. And again, as I said in my opening remarks, America at the time was actually very isolationist, and at the time, and this was coming off of World War I, which was only a decade in the rearview mirror. People did not want to be involved in the affairs of another country. And in fact, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, I think one of the things that he really felt was important was not to become involved in the domestic affairs of another country. And so as a result, our ambassadors in both in Italy and in Germany took very much of a sort of a hands-off approach, to be honest. They were not terribly outspoken about some of the things that they saw. In the end, Dodd tried to be, but he felt handcuffed by the State Department, and he felt ignored. So I think it's a real issue. The other thing I would say about today is that while I think people understand that we live in a much more sort of globalized world, again, people really don't want the United States to be terribly active. I think I don't exactly know how to describe it, but I will tell you one thing. When it's always interesting when you see these surveys about how much foreign assistance that the United States provides to other countries, and if you ask people who just sort of the man on the street, you'll get wildly varying answers. A lot of people will say 20%, 25%. I mean, they think it's outrageous, and in fact, it's less than 1% that we provide in foreign assistance. And I'm very much a believer that foreign assistance has to be tied to a strategy. I don't think and that's a controversial view, by the way. I don't think that we give foreign assistance for foreign assistance sake. But I do believe that it needs to be tied to a purpose. And I do believe it's very important as an adjunct to our overall diplomacy. So it's a struggle to explain to people why alliances are important, why foreign assistance is important. It was a struggle in the 1930s. It's a struggle today.
Yeah, that's why great organizations like the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire exist,
Absolutely.
right?
I mean, it's true. You know, I think there are 90 World Affairs organizations around the country, if I'm not mistaken. And that's, I believe, really important to get the message out. Both Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, and actually John Kerry as well, all tried to give speeches around the country to tell people, you know, that foreign policy matters for economic policy, it matters for trade, it matters for the bottom line, for kitchen table issues. And we've got a long way to go still.
Yeah, well, it gets into the whole idea of the foreign policy for the middle class.
Right, absolutely.
So you mentioned in your response to the last question, the disinterest in getting involved in the affairs of other countries. And Sharon is asking, should we care that authoritarianism is on the rise, or should we just leave other countries be?
Well, again, that's a good question, and it depends what you mean. It depends what you mean by leave other countries be. You know, I think we should care that authoritarianism is on the rise. You know, we do not want a China that controls the trade routes in the Pacific. That's not in our interests. And so that, you know, we don't want, I don't think we don't want, you know, human rights to be violated around the world. I think we need to speak out about those things. So the question is, you know, what do we do when we see another country that is an illiberal state and where democracy is being taken away from people? And that's a much tougher, you know, that's a much tougher answer. Because the tools in the toolbox are, you know, they're not necessarily ones that can always be effective, and it's why we're seeing, you know, I think honestly, some backsliding in terms of democratic countries around the world. Just sanctions can be, if they're really targeted, can be useful. But they're hard to implement. They're hard to enforce. There is economic pressure that can be used, and that is you know, an extremely important tool. And honestly, you know, shining a light on these issues is still important. It's less important than it was, however. You know, unfortunately, somebody like Putin really doesn't care if he's called a crook and a thief and a murderer. He could care less. And so for many of these authoritarian leaders now, it's as long as they're in power, that's the only thing they care about. And they're, you know, they're grifters who are blatantly stealing from their populations. And so it's, again, extremely difficult to remove them from power. And it's not something that we should be actively engaged in terms of, you know, militarily or otherwise, I don't think. But there are pressure points that we can apply. And again, one of the things that's so important, and I saw this, you know, just as I traveled to 40 countries when I was at policy planning and had meetings, you know, all over the world. And it's remarkable to me how people look to the United States as a model for the kind of life that they want to live. People, you know, people think this country stands for something because we do have free speech, because we are an educated country, because we allow differences of opinion. We allow people to express themselves and to worship you know, who they want to worship. So it's critically important, again, that we fortify those institutions at home as well.
Okay, so we've been getting a number of questions about the role in which John Winnet, former New Hampshire governor and ambassador, played in all of this, and whether or not you cover any of his contributions moving forward. So could you just
Sure.
make any comments you'd like to about
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer, unfortunately, is no. He comes in at the very end of the book because he obviously replaces Joseph Kennedy. I know many of you have probably read Citizens of London by Lynn Olson, who incidentally gave me a wonderful blurb on the back of my book. But John Winnet, and that is a wonderful book. It's just a fabulous book, and it really highlights. I was talking about it with my wife today. John Winnet is really highlighted in that book. And I've actually know Lynn Olson reasonably well, and one of the things that she talks about is that it was such a gift for her to be able to really expose this extraordinary man to the wider public, that he was not as well known as he should be. And I will just tell you that it's sort of in my book, when he leaves, and when Kennedy leaves and when it replaces him, there's this scene where London is being bombed, when it's in his office, and across the street he sees a bomb fall and a building is partially destroyed, and he doesn't run to the basement. He runs outside the embassy to help people, and he doesn't he's not wearing a baseball cap that says ambassador on it. He's just there because that's his impulse. But people recognize him. And a few days later, there are a number of stories in a number of papers in the United Kingdom about the American ambassador who was helping people on the street, and it provided sort of such a contrast to, frankly, to Kennedy, who by that time was not well liked, that it really sort of set one up for to be the people's ambassador. And he did a great service to the United Kingdom and to the United States as well. He was a great ambassador.
Well, we always got to get our global connections here in New Hampshire into these. So thank you for filling us in there. I'm going to do one more question on the history, and then we'll move to more modern day. Peter Bowman is asking, you mentioned the role that Eleanor Roosevelt played. Can you expand on that a little bit? And then also talk a little bit about the role that Angela Merkel has been playing in today's world.
Sure. So, Eleanor Roosevelt, I sort of view as the political conscience of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, you have to sort of imagine again this man in the White House dealing with this extraordinary set of circumstances, the Great Depression, where again, 25%, we've had sort of anything over 5% unemployment. It's been in COVID, it was a really rough time. But the Great Depression, and I'm sure many of your parents and grandparents lived through it. It was an extraordinary time with more than 25% unemployment and people so displaced. And so Roosevelt had this set of issues, and plus the rise of fascism in Europe. So there was an awful lot on his plate. And my feeling about him was that he was always juggling these issues. And he would try to keep 3 or 4 balls in the air at one time. And he knew that if he tried to do more, he was going to drop one. And as a result, I think he was a flawed individual. He made some bad mistakes, but I think he was a great president. But there are a couple of situations where, Eleanor, with Breckenridge Long, he is throwing up these roadblocks to immigration. And he actually writes this memo. Eleanor doesn't see the memo, neither does Franklin. It's to a fellow, it's to a colleague in the State Department. But he talks about how, he's worried about too many Jews coming into the United States. And he says, one of the things we can do is tell all the consuls that we're gonna take this very, very slowly. He said, we just postpone and postpone and postpone. So he gets a reputation in the State Department as somebody who is really a roadblock to allowing people who desperately need to get into this company. He's a roadblock. And so Drew Pearson, I think it's Drew Pearson, who was a columnist for the Times Herald, writes a column and in the paper, and talks about how I think he quotes Albert Einstein, and he's basically saying that Breckenridge Long is not acting in the best interest of the country. And Eleanor's having breakfast with Franklin, and at one point she's reading this column, and she looks up at Franklin and she says, Franklin, Breckenridge Long is a fascist. And you just Franklin Roosevelt's this WASP, he's this wealthy, very sort of upper crust individual, and he says, "Oh, Eleanor, you must not say that." And she looks at him, deadpan, and she says, "Franklin, I'm saying it because it's true." And that's the kind of moment that I think actually did impact Roosevelt. And there's another example where a ship carrying a lot of Jews from Europe was turned away in a number of locations, finally docked in, I believe, in Virginia Beach. And Breckenridge Long was not allowing anybody to get off the boat. And Eleanor figured out a way to get around it with another State Department official, and all of these individuals were able to get visas and leave the boat. And I can't remember exactly the context, but one letter describes how thank God for Franklin Roosevelt, but because afterwards a number of these individuals wrote letters to the president, but there's one letter that came in that said, "Thank God for Eleanor Roosevelt." Somehow this individual had figured out that it was she that had really sort of helped to get this thing done. So I just feel as though she was often, and they're just she's not a regular in the book, but she pops up every now and then as sort of this political conscience of the administration, and I have a lot of admiration for her. Angela Merkel is different from Eleanor Roosevelt, and because she is the elected leader of a country for 13 years, maybe 16 years. Extraordinary woman who has been a stalwart. Has made some mistakes over time, but she has kept the European Union really intact, and I think functioning quite well. She's obviously a German first and foremost, but she's a great believer in the concept of the European Union as well. And she's going to be very, very difficult to replace. And it'll be interesting to see who steps forward because I do believe that there's always one or two Europeans who, while they're maybe the European Union, it's the individual leaders who provide sort of the, in many ways, the backbone for the institutions. And it'll be interesting to see if Macron steps into into that role. It's not clear at the moment.
Well, there's certainly a lot of change going on over across the Atlantic, and that makes me want to turn to a lot of the questions that are coming in. Of course, we see Russia moving a bunch of troops to the Ukraine border. We know what's been going on there since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So Philip, as well as other people, are asking the current climate in Ukraine. How can the U.S. ensure the safety of NATO allies when Russia seems unable or unwilling to cooperate?
It's again, that's a very, very good question, and it's a very tough question to answer. Look, I think that the United States has to provide Ukraine with the weapons that it needs at this point. And there was some debate over this in the Obama administration. Ukraine was a very difficult country to even talk about during the Trump administration. But at this point, we've got to be providing, I think, substantial military support to them. NATO is, again, a very strong and critical institution here. I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. And I don't know whether or not NATO would engage if the Soviets came across the border to Donetsk or not. I mean, they're there now, but whether they would actually attempt a greater invasion, I just don't have the answer to it. I haven't seen any. I don't. Part of it is I don't have the intelligence briefings anymore that I used to, which were very, very helpful. But the only thing that we can do at this point, because we've been engaged diplomatically there for 5 years without success, as has Europe, is to make it costly for the Soviets if they try something.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions.
Russians.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions that are still up in the air as to what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And how this all plays out. So one thing that seems to also be coming up a lot is the role of ambassadors. Can you talk a little bit about, Tom Horgan is asking, do ambassadors today play as key a role as they did leading up to World War II?
It's a great question. So, it's interesting. Ambassadors during the 1930s, there's this wonderful quote that I have in the book from John Gunther, who many of you may know is the author of a book called Death Be Not Proud. He also wrote a book about Franklin Roosevelt, a short biography of him. And he said that Roosevelt picked ambassadors, and this is a little not politically correct, but he said Roosevelt picked ambassadors like a housewife choosing apples over the phone. And that's not entirely true, but there's an ounce of truth to that. Roosevelt wanted people he knew. He wanted people who he was friendly with. He wanted people who he felt were going to be loyal to him. He didn't necessarily always choose the best ambassadors. And Breckenridge Long and Joe Kennedy are the prime examples of that. Bill Bullitt, however, was an enormously talented individual, and William Dodd turned that out to be, in some ways, the most prescient of all the ambassadors that I talk about. But the role of ambassador in those days, Roosevelt had huge contempt for the Department of State. It was a organization. It was 700 diplomats and 2,500 all men, and 2,500 support staff, most of whom were women. And in this country, only we only were engaged in 60 missions abroad, and because of the aftermath of World War I, we didn't really have sort of a collective view of sort of what the United States' role in the world was at that time. And as a result, and the reason I think Roosevelt had contempt for the department was that you had a lot of, rich Ivy League educated men, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, who, Roosevelt referred to as the striped pants boys, who could often be rather self-indulgent. Ambassador Dodd complained about the fact that they got to work at 11 and left at 3 and had lunches in between. And so it did not have the kind of energy or expertise that was needed at the time, frankly. Today, I can tell you that the State Department really is, I think it's one of the great government institutions we have. The people in the State Department are dedicated and they are smart. And it's and I felt so honored to be a part of it. And I really mean that. And ambassadors, the role they play today, they don't make foreign policy. They communicate it, and at times they implement it. But I remember one thing that, Secretary Kerry said to me. Now, I was ambassador in Luxembourg, and that was, not a country that was in dire straits. There were issues, and because it was a founding member of NATO and a founding member of European Union, there were a lot of issues surrounding Europe that they were deeply interested in. And, I had a good relationship with a number of people in that government and with a number of my fellow ambassadors. And I think, hopefully played a useful role there. But there are ambassadors in certain countries. And obviously, when you think of Iraq and think of South, Sudan and troubled spots around the world, who I remember Secretary Kerry saying to me, these guys actually hold these countries together in many respects. And what he meant by that was that they count on the wisdom of the U.S. viewpoint, and they care what the United States says, and they obviously care about assistance from the United States. And so ambassadors can play an incredibly important role in a number of those countries. And in China, to get back to China for a second, again, just a very, very quick story. I remember I had policy planning talks with the Chinese, and I remember we focused on the South China Sea, and I gave rather extemporaneous remarks, somewhat as I'm doing today. And then although I studied pretty hard for it and was well prepared, I think. My Chinese counterpart then pulled out from his briefcase a document and read it in Chinese, and it was about South China Sea and how this was their right, and they were not doing anything they were not militarizing the islands, and these were for environmental study. A lot of just outright lies, frankly. But he read it. And, what was so amusing to me was then his interpreter pulled out a document and read the same thing in English. It was so sort of calculated and canned, and that's how the Chinese operate. It comes down from below, and everybody literally is on the same page, and they tell you one thing, whether it's the truth or not the truth. They just stay on message the whole time. So it's very tough to have a real conversation with them. Having said that, you need diplomats at all levels engaging with the Chinese and absolutely telling them our position and why it's important to the United States, and what the consequences will be if there are going to be consequences. And you need it on a continuing level. On a continuing basis. And so, for example, you mentioned Nick Burns. He's being held up in the United States Senate for no good reason, as far as I'm concerned. Now, this is one of our finest diplomats that we have. He was ambassador to NATO. He was ambassador to Greece. He was the spokesman for the department at one time. He's worked in both Democratic and Republican administrations. He's not a partisan individual. This guy needs to be confirmed. We need him there. We need him because it's important to engage all the time. So that's my one sort of soapbox piece of advice today, I guess.
Well, we always love a good soapbox, right? So, obviously these ambassadors do a wonderful job promoting U.S. interests abroad, but I'm sure they're also a great tool for gathering information, being the eyes and ears of the country in important places. So Kathy here has a great question who in the Ambassador Corps should we be listening today? Who is ringing the right alarm bells?
Well, that's, the problem is not that many of our ambassadors have actually been confirmed. So many of them are being held in the Senate. This is very different from the 1930s, for example. William Dodd, Roosevelt couldn't find a diplomat to serve in Berlin. He decides on William Dodd. He is voted out he doesn't even have a hearing in the Senate. He's just voted out, sort of a week after Roosevelt sends him up to the United States Senate. Now, I'm not saying that we should, voice vote every ambassador. They should have hearings, and if there's issues that need to be debated on the Senate floor, fine, but air them, get them out, and ask those questions in a hearing, and have them debated. That's fine. But most ambassadors have not had have not been confirmed. I mean, there've been a handful of career foreign service officers that are in place now, more than a handful, and a handful of politicals who have been confirmed as well. But most politicals have not been confirmed. So it's I think the people you want to listen to again are going to be the people in the countries that we care about. Jeff Flake is going to Turkey. He has been confirmed. We want to know what's going on in Turkey. If Nick Burns ever and you're absolutely right, by the way, that listening is a huge part of this. It is a huge part of this, and I should have mentioned it. I mean, it's one of the biggest and most important parts of the job. Not only the ambassador, but all the the staff. You want to be out talking to people, and it's something frankly, I really enjoyed doing. But you want in these key countries, in Russia, in China, in Turkey, in Belarus, in Myanmar, wherever you see illiberalism rising, we need to be listening to our ambassadors and understanding exactly what is going on in the country, because they provide hugely important information.
All right, so we are just about at our hour now, but I do want to give you one final opportunity to end with some hopefully positive, bright spots that we can look forward to. Anything that you really think our audience should hear?
No, I guess I would only reiterate what I said earlier, which is that this is something that Ronald Reagan got exactly right. And I'm not a Ronald Reagan Republican, but boy, did he nail it. Freedom is the most important concept, ideal in the world. And when we embrace that, and when we have democratic institutions that support it, we really can't be stopped. And we are so admired because of that around the world. And when we have political discord and political dysfunction at home, it really hurts us. It really hurts us. So, I'm optimistic about the future in most ways, but honestly, I'm a little worried as well. But again, I think these kinds of discussions, and the fact that there are so many of these councils around the country, to me is really important. And I really, again, just thank you all for tuning in tonight or later on. And Tim and Alan, again, thanks so much for hosting me tonight.
Well, thank you for your time. We really appreciate you offering up your insights. For our audience, we love to thank you for your interest in our programs and your attendance here tonight, or again, if you're watching the replay. We are looking forward to getting our schedule up for 2022. Be on the lookout. We do have one program that we are just about to be able to announce. We have to confirm one final thing, but we will be hopefully announcing that in the coming days or weeks. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your interest and your support. Have a wonderful end of your year and a happy new year.